A grocery store manager's blind hatred cost him $50,000 in his entire career in less than 30 minutes. What started as a simple product exchange turned into a courtroom nightmare he never saw coming. Jerome Sullivan walked into Meadowbrook Supermarket that Tuesday afternoon expecting nothing more than a quick shopping trip. He needed supplies for the week. A simple routine, but what happened next would expose the ugliest side of retail discrimination and prove that ignorance comes with a price tag. The manager thought he was dealing with just another customer he could bully and disrespect. He had no clue who he was really talking to. By the time the truth came out, witnesses were recording, and a federal badge was about to flip everything upside down. You're not going to believe how fast this situation unraveled. The look on that manager's face when reality hit him was priceless, and the aftermath, even better. Right now, before we get into the full story, I want to say thank you for being here. Your support means everything to this channel, and we're glad you chose to spend your time with us. Let's connect for a second. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and give us a like. We've got plenty more stories like this one coming your way, and you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into what happened that day. Jerome Sullivan was off duty that afternoon. No badge clipped to his belt. No firearm holstered at his side. Just a federal agent trying to get groceries like any other person. He worked long hours at the FBI field office downtown, and his schedule rarely gave him time for mundane errands. But today was different. He had the afternoon free and his refrigerator was almost empty. Meadowbrook Supermarket sat on the east side of town. It was a mid-sized store, nothing fancy, but it had everything he needed. Jerome grabbed a cart and moved through the aisles methodically. Milk, bread, fresh vegetables, chicken breasts, pasta, canned goods. He wasn't picky. He just wanted to stock up and get home. The store was moderately busy. A few families wandered the aisles. Elderly shoppers compared prices on cereal boxes. Employees restocked shelves and directed customers to different sections. Everything felt normal, predictable, safe. Jerome made his way to the checkout area after about 20 minutes. His cart was full but organized. He began unloading items onto the conveyor belt, placing them carefully so the cashier could scan them efficiently. That's when he noticed it. One of the pasta sauce jars had a crack running down the side. The glass wasn't shattered, but it was damaged enough that the seal looked compromised. Jerome picked it up and examined it closely. He hadn't caused the damage. The jar was already cracked when he pulled it from the shelf. He simply hadn't noticed it until now. No big deal. He'd just swap it for a new one. Happens all the time in grocery stores. Customers return damaged products. Staff exchanges them without issue. Simple transaction, basic customer service. Jerome turned to the cashier, a young woman named Lisa who looked barely out of high school. She seemed nervous but polite. He held up the jar and explained the situation calmly. His tone was respectful. His body language was relaxed. There was no aggression, no attitude, just a customer requesting a product exchange. But Lisa didn't have the authority to approve the return. She glanced toward the front of the store and called for her manager. That decision set everything in motion. The manager appeared within seconds. His name was Daniel Pritchard, a man in his late 40s with thinning hair and a permanent scowl etched across his face. He'd been managing Meadowbrook Supermarket for nearly a decade, and his reputation among staff was less than stellar. Employees whispered about his short temper and his tendency to treat certain customers differently than others. But corporate never seemed to notice, or maybe they just didn't care. Daniel approached the register with his arms crossed. He didn't greet Jerome. He didn't ask what the problem was. He just stared at the jar in Jerome's hand with immediate suspicion. Lisa tried to explain that the customer wanted to exchange a damaged item, but Daniel cut her off mid-sentence. He snatched the jar from Jerome's hand without asking and held it up to the light, examining it like a detective analyzing evidence at a crime scene. Jerome remained calm. He'd dealt with difficult people before. His job required patience and composure in high-pressure situations. A grocery store manager with an attitude was nothing compared to the cases he handled daily. He simply waited for Daniel to finish his inspection and approve the exchange. But Daniel had already made up his mind. He shook his head and placed the jar on the counter with unnecessary force. He told Jerome that he couldn't accept the return. According to Daniel, the damage looked fresh. He claimed Jerome must have dropped it or handled it roughly while shopping. There was no way the jar came off the shelf like that. Someone had to be responsible, and Daniel decided that someone was Jerome. Jerome's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. He explained again that the jar was already damaged when he picked it up. He hadn't dropped anything. He hadn't mishandled any products. He simply wanted to exchange one defective item for a good one. That's what any reasonable customer would expect. Daniel wasn't interested in reason. His eyes narrowed, and his tone shifted from suspicious to outright hostile. He accused Jerome of trying to scam the store. He said people like him always tried to get free products by claiming things were broken. He suggested Jerome was lying to avoid paying full price. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Other customers started to notice the commotion. A few people slowed their shopping and glanced toward the register. Lisa looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from foot to foot. She clearly wanted to de-escalate the situation, but Daniel was her boss. She couldn't contradict him without risking her job. Jerome felt the familiar weight of injustice settling on his shoulders. He'd experienced this before. The assumptions, the accusations, the immediate distrust. But he wasn't about to let this man steamroll him. He kept his voice level and asked Daniel directly what evidence he had that the damage was Jerome's fault. Security cameras covered the store. If Daniel was so certain Jerome had broken the jar, they could review the footage together. That suggestion seemed to irritate Daniel even more. His face flushed red, and his posture became more aggressive. The situation was spiraling, and everyone watching could feel it. Daniel's mask of professionalism completely disintegrated. What came next wasn't just poor customer service. It was something far uglier. Something that revealed exactly who Daniel Pritchard really was beneath the manager's uniform and the fake smile he wore for certain customers. He stepped closer to Jerome, invading his personal space deliberately. His voice dropped low but loud enough for nearby customers to hear every word. He told Jerome that he knew his type. People who come in here thinking they can take advantage of hardworking businesses. People who always have some complaint or some excuse. He said the store didn't need customers like Jerome. They didn't need troublemakers who tried to steal by claiming products were defective. Then Daniel crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The racial slurs came next. Words that don't need to be repeated in detail but cut through the air like knives. He questioned whether Jerome could even afford to shop there. He made assumptions about where Jerome lived and how he made his money. He suggested Jerome should go back to wherever he came from and stop wasting everyone's time. Every sentence dripped with hatred that had clearly been festering for years. The store went silent. Customers froze in the aisles. Lisa's face went pale. An elderly woman near the produce section gasped audibly. A teenager pulled out his phone and started recording. The atmosphere shifted from uncomfortable to absolutely toxic in seconds. Jerome stood perfectly still. His hands remained at his sides. His breathing stayed controlled. Every instinct in his body screamed to respond with the anger that Daniel deserved. But Jerome's training kicked in. He'd been taught to never lose control, especially in public situations. Especially when someone was trying to provoke him. He knew exactly what Daniel wanted. Daniel wanted him to react violently, to yell, to throw something, to give Daniel justification for calling security and having him removed or arrested. Jerome refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, he looked Daniel directly in the eyes and spoke with a calmness that seemed to unsettle the manager. He told Daniel that his words were being recorded by multiple witnesses. He said that what just happened constituted discrimination and harassment. He informed Daniel that his behavior violated both store policy and federal law, and he strongly suggested that Daniel reconsider his approach before this situation got worse for everyone involved. But Daniel had gone too far to back down now. His pride wouldn't allow it. He'd publicly humiliated this customer, and admitting he was wrong would mean admitting everything else about his character. So instead of apologizing, he doubled down. He told Jerome that he had no authority to threaten him. He said that if Jerome didn't leave the store immediately, he would call the police and have him removed for trespassing and attempted theft. Jerome almost smiled at that. He asked Daniel if he was absolutely certain he wanted to involve law enforcement. He gave Daniel one more opportunity to de-escalate. One more chance to simply exchange the jar and let everyone move on with their day. One final moment to avoid the consequences that were about to crash down on him. Daniel's response was to pull out his cell phone and dial the police. He reported a theft attempt and a disruptive customer refusing to leave. He described Jerome in terms that were clearly designed to make officers assume the worst. He wanted them to arrive ready for confrontation, ready to side with him automatically, ready to remove this customer by force if necessary. Jerome simply waited. He didn't leave. He didn't argue. He just stood there with his damaged jar of pasta sauce while Daniel made the biggest mistake of his career. The trap was set. Daniel just didn't know he'd walked right into it. 2 patrol cars pulled into the Meadowbrook supermarket parking lot within 8 minutes. Officers Taylor Brady and Michelle Cortez were the first to arrive, followed shortly by another unit. They'd received the call about a theft attempt and a belligerent customer refusing to leave the premises. The dispatcher's notes painted a picture of a potentially volatile situation that required immediate attention. Daniel met the officers at the entrance with the confidence of someone who believed the law was automatically on his side. He waved them inside urgently and started talking before they could even assess the scene. He pointed toward Jerome, who still stood calmly at the checkout counter, and launched into his version of events. According to Daniel, Jerome had damaged store property, refused to pay for it, became aggressive when confronted, and then threatened him with legal action. Daniel painted himself as a victim trying to protect his business from a dangerous individual. Officer Brady listened with his hand resting casually near his belt. He was a veteran cop with 15 years on the force, and he'd learned to assess situations carefully before jumping to conclusions. Something about Daniel's story felt off. The man was too eager, too animated, and the supposed threat at the checkout counter didn't match Daniel's description at all. Jerome stood motionless with his hands visible, making no aggressive movements whatsoever. Officer Cortez approached Jerome first. Her approach was professional but cautious. She asked him to step away from the counter and explain his side of the story. Jerome complied immediately. He moved to where she directed him without resistance. His voice was steady as he explained exactly what happened. He showed her the damaged jar. He pointed to the security cameras. He mentioned the witnesses who'd recorded Daniel's verbal assault. He kept his explanation factual and brief. More customers had gathered now, forming a loose circle around the scene. Several people spoke up voluntarily, confirming Jerome's account. The teenager who'd been recording offered to show his footage to the officers. An elderly man stated clearly that the manager had used racial slurs and made threats. A woman with 2 young children said she'd heard everything and was disgusted by Daniel's behavior. Daniel's confidence started to crack. He interrupted repeatedly, trying to discredit the witnesses. He claimed they were lying or misunderstood what they heard. He insisted that Jerome was manipulating the situation and turning people against him. But his protests only made him look more desperate. Officer Brady asked him to step back and let them do their job. Officer Cortez returned to Jerome and asked for his identification. It was standard procedure. Everyone involved in an incident needed to be properly identified before officers could file their report. Jerome reached slowly into his pocket, narrating his movements so there would be no misunderstanding. He pulled out his wallet and handed it to Officer Cortez. She opened it expecting to see a driver's license. What she found instead made her pause. Her eyes widened slightly. She looked up at Jerome, then back down at the identification in her hand. She called Officer Brady over quietly and showed him what she'd discovered. Brady's entire demeanor changed. His casual stance became more formal, more respectful. He looked at Jerome with new understanding and a hint of concern about how this call had been handled so far. Daniel noticed the shift immediately. He stepped forward, demanding to know what was going on. Why were the officers suddenly treating this criminal with kid gloves? Why weren't they arresting him for theft and trespassing? Officer Brady turned to Daniel with an expression that could only be described as uncomfortable. The power dynamic in that store was about to flip completely, and Daniel was the only person who didn't see it coming yet. The moment of truth was seconds away, and there would be no walking it back. Officer Cortez handed the identification back to Jerome with noticeably more respect than when she'd first approached him. She apologized quietly for the confusion and asked if he needed anything. Her partner stood beside her, reassessing everything that had just transpired. The rookie officer from the 2nd unit looked completely confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Daniel couldn't stand being left out of the conversation. He pushed forward again, demanding answers. He wanted to know why these officers were suddenly treating a shoplifter like royalty. He insisted they do their jobs and arrest this man for the crimes he'd clearly committed. His voice grew louder with each word, and his frustration was palpable. Officer Brady turned to face Daniel directly. His tone was professional but carried an edge of warning. He informed Daniel that the man he'd been verbally assaulting for the past 20 minutes was Special Agent Jerome Sullivan with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Daniel's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief. Then slowly, horrifyingly, the realization began to sink in. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color drained from his cheeks. His hands, which had been gesturing wildly moments before, dropped to his sides limply. The customers watching erupted in whispers. Phones that had been recording captured Daniel's reaction in perfect detail. Lisa covered her mouth with both hands. The elderly man who'd witnessed everything shook his head in disgust. The teenager recording couldn't believe what he'd just heard and immediately checked to make sure his video was still rolling. Jerome remained calm throughout the revelation. He'd been waiting for this moment. He'd known exactly how it would play out the second Daniel decided to call the police. He could have shown his credentials earlier and ended the confrontation immediately, but he'd wanted Daniel to dig himself into a hole deep enough that there would be consequences. Real consequences. The kind that couldn't be ignored or swept under the rug by corporate management. Officer Cortez asked Jerome if he wanted to press charges for the verbal assault and discrimination. She made it clear that multiple witnesses and video evidence supported his account of what happened. The department would fully cooperate with any complaint he chose to file. Daniel finally found his voice. He started backtracking immediately. He claimed there had been a misunderstanding. He said he didn't mean any of the things that came out of his mouth. He insisted he was just trying to protect his store from what he thought was theft. He apologized profusely, his words tumbling over each other in desperate succession. But everyone in that store knew exactly what they'd heard. Misunderstanding wasn't an option. Those words had been deliberate, hateful, inexcusable. Jerome let Daniel finish his pathetic attempt at an apology before responding. His voice was measured and cold. He told Daniel that apologies didn't erase what happened. They didn't undo the humiliation. They didn't take back the slurs or the assumptions or the threats. An apology after getting caught wasn't remorse. It was self-preservation. Then Jerome made his request clear. He wanted the security footage from the past hour. All of it. Every camera angle that captured the interaction from the moment he entered the store until right now. He wanted witness statements from everyone who saw or heard what happened. And he wanted the name and contact information for the corporate office that oversaw this location. Officer Brady assured him that everything would be documented properly. The security footage would be preserved as evidence. Witness statements would be collected. A full report would be filed. He asked if Jerome wanted to pursue criminal charges in addition to any civil action. Jerome considered that for a moment. He could have Daniel arrested right now for harassment and discrimination. The evidence was overwhelming, but he had something bigger in mind. Something that would send a message far beyond this one incident. He told Officer Brady that he would be pursuing a civil lawsuit against both Daniel personally and the supermarket chain. He wanted accountability at every level. He wanted changes implemented so this never happened to anyone else. Daniel's legs seemed to give out. He leaned against the checkout counter for support. His career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and the financial consequences hadn't even started yet. The store manager's office became a temporary command center for evidence collection. Officer Brady worked with the store's assistant manager, a woman named Patricia who'd been in the back during the entire incident, to access the security system. She looked horrified when she learned what Daniel had done. She'd worked with him for 6 years and never imagined he was capable of such blatant discrimination. Or maybe she just never wanted to believe it. The footage was comprehensive. Meadowbrook Supermarket had 12 cameras covering every angle of the store. The system recorded continuously in high definition with timestamps on every frame. Patricia pulled up the relevant time period and began exporting the files to a secure drive. The video showed everything. Jerome entering the store, his methodical shopping, the moment he discovered the damaged jar, his calm interaction with the cashier, Daniel's aggressive approach, the confrontation escalating. Every word, every gesture, every hateful expression on Daniel's face. Officer Cortez interviewed witnesses in a separate area of the store. She took detailed statements from 7 customers who'd seen or heard the confrontation. Each account corroborated Jerome's version of events. The teenager with the cell phone video provided his footage willingly. He'd captured the worst of Daniel's verbal assault in crystal-clear audio. The elderly man who'd spoken up earlier gave a particularly damning statement about the racial slurs he'd heard. He was a retired judge, and his testimony would carry significant weight in any legal proceeding. Jerome sat in the break room reviewing documents on his phone. He'd already contacted his supervisor at the FBI field office to report the incident. Protocol required notification anytime an agent was involved in a potential legal matter, even as a victim. His supervisor was furious on his behalf and assured him the Bureau would provide whatever support he needed. Jerome also reached out to a civil rights attorney he'd worked with on previous cases. The lawyer listened to the summary and immediately agreed to take the case. Daniel remained near the front of the store under Officer Brady's supervision. He wasn't under arrest, but he wasn't free to leave either. His employment status was about to change dramatically. Patricia had already called the regional manager and explained the situation. Corporate was sending representatives immediately. They needed to assess the damage and determine how to proceed. A lawsuit involving federal agents and clear evidence of discrimination was a public relations nightmare. Within an hour, 2 corporate executives arrived. They wore expensive suits and carried leather briefcases filled with legal documents. They spoke with Patricia first, then reviewed the security footage themselves. Their faces went grim as they watched Daniel's behavior play out on screen. One of them made a phone call that lasted 15 minutes. When he hung up, he approached Jerome directly. The executive introduced himself as Robert Hillman, Vice President of Operations for the supermarket chain. He apologized on behalf of the company for what Jerome had experienced. He assured him that Daniel's behavior did not reflect company values or policies. He explained that Daniel would be terminated immediately and that the company would cooperate fully with any investigation or legal action. He offered compensation for the distress caused, though he was careful not to make any specific financial commitments that might complicate future proceedings. Jerome listened politely but remained non-committal. He thanked Robert for the apology but made it clear that words weren't enough. He wanted systemic change. He wanted mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees. He wanted clear reporting procedures for customers who experienced bias. He wanted accountability measures that prevented managers like Daniel from abusing their power. And he wanted financial compensation that reflected the severity of what happened. Robert nodded solemnly and promised that corporate would address all of those concerns. He provided his direct contact information and the name of the company's lead attorney. He knew a lawsuit was coming regardless of what he said today, but he wanted to demonstrate good faith cooperation. Officer Brady finished his report and provided Jerome with copies of all documentation: the case number, the witness statements, confirmation that the security footage had been properly preserved, everything Jerome would need for his legal case. Brady also quietly mentioned that he'd be happy to testify if needed. He'd seen enough discrimination in his years on the force to recognize it instantly, and he had zero tolerance for it. Daniel was escorted from the building by security. His termination was effective immediately. No severance, no references. Just a humiliating walk to his car while former employees and customers watched. His decade-long career ended in disgrace, and the consequences were only beginning. The lawsuit filed 3 weeks later made local headlines immediately. Special Agent Jerome Sullivan versus Daniel Pritchard and Meadowbrook Supermarket Corporation. The complaint detailed every aspect of the incident with supporting evidence that was impossible to dispute. Security footage, multiple witness statements, audio recordings, officer reports. The case was airtight, and every attorney who reviewed it knew the defendants had no viable defense. Daniel's personal attorney advised him to settle quickly. Fighting the lawsuit would only drain his savings and result in a worse outcome. The evidence was overwhelming. His own words were recorded from multiple angles. Witnesses included a retired judge and active duty police officers. There was no scenario where Daniel walked away victorious. His attorney negotiated on his behalf, but the position was weak from the start. The supermarket corporation wanted to settle even more urgently. Their legal team understood the public relations disaster this case represented. A federal agent discriminated against by their manager, while security cameras captured everything. The story had already spread across social media. Activists were organizing boycotts. News outlets were requesting interviews. Every day the case dragged on meant more negative publicity and lost revenue. Settlement negotiations moved quickly. Jerome's attorney presented demands that reflected both the emotional harm and the broader message that needed to be sent. Financial compensation for the discrimination, public apology from the corporation, mandatory company-wide anti-bias training, new policies for handling discrimination complaints, independent oversight of management practices, and personal accountability for Daniel that extended beyond just losing his job. The final settlement was reached 6 weeks after the incident. Daniel Pritchard was ordered to pay $50,000 in damages directly to Jerome. The amount represented more than a year of his former salary. His savings were decimated. His credit was destroyed. His reputation in the retail industry was finished. No company would hire him after what he'd done. The judgment would follow him for years, a permanent reminder of the cost of hatred. The supermarket corporation paid an additional undisclosed sum as part of their settlement agreement. Industry insiders estimated it was well into 6 figures when legal fees and reputation management costs were included. More importantly, they implemented every policy change Jerome demanded. Every employee from cashiers to regional managers underwent 8 hours of mandatory anti-discrimination training. New reporting systems were established for customers to file complaints confidentially. Independent auditors reviewed hiring and promotion practices to identify patterns of bias. The changes affected hundreds of stores across multiple states. Jerome donated a significant portion of his settlement to civil rights organizations that fought discrimination in retail and service industries. He gave interviews to local media explaining why he pursued the case so aggressively. It wasn't about the money, it was about accountability. It was about making sure the next person who walked into that store wouldn't face what he faced. It was about proving that hatred has consequences regardless of who you are or what position you hold. The story resonated far beyond that one supermarket. Other companies took notice and began reviewing their own policies. Employees who'd experienced similar discrimination felt empowered to speak up. Managers who might have acted like Daniel thought twice before letting their prejudices show. The ripple effect was exactly what Jerome hoped for. Daniel Pritchard disappeared from public life entirely. He moved out of state shortly after the settlement. His social media accounts were deleted. His former colleagues reported that he was working warehouse jobs for a fraction of his previous salary. The man who'd wielded power so carelessly over others now struggled to find anyone willing to trust him with responsibility. Some might call it karma. Others would call it justice. Either way, his actions caught up with him in the most permanent way possible. Jerome returned to his work at the FBI with renewed purpose. The incident reminded him why civil rights enforcement mattered so deeply, why laws against discrimination existed, why people needed to stand up when they witnessed injustice. He could have walked away that day. He could have shown his badge immediately and avoided the confrontation. But then Daniel would have continued treating other customers the same way. The pattern would have persisted. Nothing would have changed. Instead, Jerome chose accountability. He chose to let Daniel reveal exactly who he was and then face the full consequences of that revelation. $50,000, a destroyed career, public humiliation, a permanent stain on his record, all because he couldn't see past the color of someone's skin long enough to treat them with basic human dignity. Do you think the punishment fit the crime? Was $50,000 enough, or should the consequences have been more severe? What would you have done in Jerome's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story reminded you why accountability matters, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We've got more stories about justice, courage, and people standing up for what's right. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.